Do you ever need to persuade someone? I bet you do. We're going to talk about it in this episode, so don't go anywhere. Negotiations don't just happen in the boardroom. They happen in everyday life. I'm Susie Tomenchok, expert negotiator, author, and TEDx speaker. I'm glad you're here. I'm going to show you the art of negotiation without manipulation so you can level up, know your worth, and adopt a negotiator mindset. Let's go. Hey, welcome. I'm Susie. I'm so glad you made the choice to be here today. I'm going to talk about persuasion. And this topic is intimidating. And persuasion and negotiation are sisters. They really are. Persuasion is something that we need to do on a regular basis. And it is something that can feel manipulative because we believe we're trying to get somebody to think like us. And there's a lot of factors to it. The reason I say it's an art is because it truly is. Every situation's different. Every person's different. It's a high stakes situation for us that brings in a whole slew of emotions and anxieties and all sorts of things that also intermingle into this idea of persuasion. And especially when it's somebody we know that are going to put roadblocks in and we know it's going to be hard, or it's somebody we have no idea how difficult or how easy it's going to be to persuade. So one of the things I wanted to do today to get ready for this discussion is do a little research around persuasion, because I wanted to give you some baseline and illustrate why it's not just something that you learn to do. It's something that has a lot of levers, a lot of leverage that play a factor in it. And so the first thing that I looked at was the science of persuasion. Robert Cialdini, I read his books. He does a lot around influence. He's really great. I'll put his name in the show notes so that you can look him up. But he identifies the 6 principles of persuasion. One is reciprocity, and that means people are more likely to do something for you if you've done something for them. So think about that when you go into a situation where you need to persuade. What kind of equity have you built with this person? Consistency and commitment. People are more likely to stick to agreements that they've agreed to at the beginning. And actually in influence, they say that people are 5 times more likely to be all in if they feel a part of the process. So get the buy-in along the way. Don't go in with a laminated idea and this is what I need you to agree to. Show them your messy work. Say, this is what I want to talk about. What ideas do you have to bring to this? That will allow them to feel a part of it. The third principle is social proof. People like to do things that people have already agreed to. And some of the research around this was in neighborhoods when they showed people how many people have already voted, they're more likely to vote if that the majority of the people have already voted. So they want to be a part of the group. So thinking about who already has buy-in, who can you say, hey, listen, I've already talked to this person. I just want to get your thoughts on this as well. You two are really important stakeholders in this. So thinking about that social proof. Authority, people tend to do things that lead to credibility or making their expertise. So how can you boost that factor in your persuasion? And then likability is another principle. People like to do things with people they know, like, and trust. That is the essence of what retail looks for, is really building that relationship. So likability is super important in persuasion. So thinking about that before you go in, if you need to build that relationship. And then the final one that Robert Cialdini talks about is scarcity, that people fear missing out on something they want to be a part of. They want to know that they can put their kind of thumbprint on it as well if everybody else is in it, and they don't want to miss out. So it's just interesting for me to rekindle these ideas of what is important to other people. What are these principles and how do they play a factor in when we're persuading somebody else? And this can be in our day to day when we're working with a peer and we have to get their buy-in and help by putting some resources toward a project. We want to go to this restaurant or drive further or go eat somewhere where we know the other person isn't completely keen on that. What are these factors in our day-to-day life that we need to persuade? And even thinking about that end in mind, I'm going into this situation. I need to persuade this person to shift their thinking. Where are they starting from now? We often just go into these situations and think, oh, he is just a difficult person. I hate having these conversations with him because he'll just put all these roadblocks on, where we need to think about, where are they coming from? What factors can I give in? What relationship do I need to build? How do I get their buy-in? What's important to them? Persuasion is about taking it outside of you and thinking about the interests of the other party. Remember, when you consider the interests of the other party, your ability to have measurably better results toward the end that you want to get to is better if you consider their interests. So part of persuasion is getting out of your seat and thinking about them. And these principles that he has outlined illustrate that. They're the things, they're the factors, they're the human nature, the things that are just core to who we are in what we want. And so how can you apply these to everyday situations in our professional careers? And how can we apply these in negotiations? When we come back, I'm going to share a couple stories that relate this for me and my clients. So stay where you are. We'll get right to it. Persuasion is something that is really happening all the time. And there's so many different examples of this. When I tell you some of these stories, I thought about some that you might not think would just come to mind right away. So as I'm telling you these, think about some of the situations that you may be facing in these upcoming weeks, or that you just faced and you think, oh, that's so interesting. I did a good job. Or maybe I should have looked at this a different way. So one of my clients is she's a C-level person, and she is newer to the organization and has some really great background in the industry that she is supporting. But she has somebody that on the team that has been in the industry a lot longer than her, and has the perception that he does have a lot more institutional knowledge. And so what was happening was they also have two very different personalities, and everybody loves him and spends time with him. And she, my client, is more introverted, and she tends to really spend a lot of time working on the workflows and does really hard work, but it's behind closed doors. So there's this perception that she isn't as effective as this guy is because he just is out there more. And so what she started to do is just kind of not worry about him, kind of keep it just like he was annoying to her in her mind, not important to her in her world. But as I started talking to more people that are in her leadership group and are her direct reports, I started to see that even though he wasn't a factor in her day to day, he was telling this story, and not like really literally, but just in these little moments, he was very good at telling this narrative about her that wasn't true. So the perception of her was becoming that she was not trustworthy, that she does it for herself, and, just all these things. So she needed to persuade him. She needed to get him to just at least be on the same page as her. And really what it took was time, and spending time to understand what was important to him, and giving him a little bit of a look behind the curtain about what she was doing, so that he could start to see the impact that she was going to have in the longer term. What she was doing was a long game. What he was doing was a shorter game. And his game was to make her look bad, because he felt like that would make him look good. And so in this case, she knew she needed to persuade him to stop being such a negative factor in highlighting this perception of her that wasn't true. So she spent more time with him, and we actually had to think about how she was going to do that, to make it not like she was cowering to him, but to show the benefit that she had. And so it took an investment in time. It took time to think about how could she look at it from his side, what was important to him. She had to start showing a little bit of her institutional know-how just so that he kind of backed down a little bit. She was using evidence that she was really good at to combat some of those perceptions, but she needed to get ahead of it and really persuade him to be on her team. Not literally, but just to see it a little softer. it really over time worked, but it took some time for her to do that. It was an interesting illustration to me because it was so important that the thing that she was persuading was a shift in building that relationship and persuading him without him realizing it to take a step back to see her differently. And that was really important to her career because, to be honest, his work was really working well to get those perceptions, and it could have been really catastrophic for her because it was working in some areas that didn't have as much exposure to her as others did. So thinking about those relationships and how do you persuade, and thinking about how do you turn that person around. I thought too about a negotiation where we were talking to a client that had all these assets, all this media, and we had a technology that could take one piece of media, and think about it this way. It could do a save as really quickly so that it could go to a lot of different platforms. So you had to have a different asset, like PowerPoint and an Excel and a GIF. Like you had to have a different output from one piece of media to send it to all these different places. And we had advertised it as encode once or take this asset once and we can just send it to all these places. So what happened was we realized that that perception was then that people would only have to pay once and it would just be so cheap. And so that wasn't exactly true, because even though from a marketing perspective, we wanted to sound really easy, we still had to have hands-on from a QC perspective. And we did have to do some things to each one of those outputs to get it ready and to send it to those places. But we had done such a good job marketing it that this perception was in the marketplace. And I remember we were talking to this person that, like a Discovery, like had a lot of content that went to a lot of places. It wasn't Discovery. It was a different client, but similar to Discovery. And we were ready to combat this perception and to prove to him why he had to pay more than just one time. You had to pay for like the output instead of just the one time that we're going to manage the content. And we got into the discussion and we had all of our pieces mapped out and how we were going to convince him, and it wasn't working. And we couldn't figure out why. And so I slowed us down and started, just because I was the main person, and I started asking questions. And what we realized was, from a technology perspective, it wasn't the expense that was getting him locked up. He didn't have confidence yet that every one of the outputs was going to have a quality delivery, because it seemed so simple. He was an engineer. And so his perception was so different. So we needed to shift and persuade him differently. We needed to focus on what was important to him. And making that shift, I mean, we were so far down because we were so convinced in our mind that this was what it was. We were persuading him on something that wasn't even what was important to him. So once we locked into what was important to him, understanding how we need to move through. So I said, oh goodness, since I had a good relationship, when we think about those principles, I said to him, oh, I missed it. I thought you were really focused on this. Let's shift and talk about the quality output. That's what's really important to you. And because I had the relationship, he felt he was able to move into the dialogue and understood why we had missed it so much, and we pivoted into this discussion. So he was able to stay with us. We didn't lose a lot of credibility because I leveraged the fact that I had the relationship with him. Had I not, in that same discussion with somebody that we were talking and so focused in one area, we would not have persuaded him to go with us, because he would not have felt like we understood him. And so shifting that and thinking about what evidence you have to help them understand or make your case or persuade them. Those principles are really, really helpful factors to consider in persuasion. And it really breaks it down, because those are all factors in it. It's not just having the strongest argument. It's considering all of the lever points. What's important to the other party? What's important to you? What are you articulating? How are you framing it? So persuasion is an art. When we come back, I'll talk about some tips around what to think about stopping, starting, and continuing in considering persuasion as you move forward. So stay right here. As we move through this, as you've thought about the areas, the situations that you have or you will be persuading, I want you to think about the stop, start, and continue. What are you going to stop doing? What do you need to start doing? And what will you continue to do? So I'm just going to give you some tips around that. So one thing I want you to think about is stop missing perceptions of you. And especially internally, when you think about your influence, influence is a factor in persuasion, because when you have influence with somebody else, that's a relationship. That's high trust. You have some history with them in a good way. So thinking about if you have influence with this person or not, it can be hierarchical. It could be relational. And if you don't ignore the cues to if you have influence in where you work with the person that you're in. So stop ignoring those. Start paying attention to, are you asked for advice? Is that person look at you as somebody that is trustworthy? And if you're not sure, do some investment in that before you get to a situation where you need to persuade them in a way. And the second one around stop is don't ignore the politics, the hierarchy, what's important to the other side, whether it's a client, whether it's your boss, whether it's your boss's peer. Think about the power in the room. What is their perception of power? Do they feel like they have the power to make the decision over you because of the hierarchy? What are you going to do to persuade them differently if that's their view of how decisions are made? That's a really important factor. So don't ignore those. Stop ignoring them and think about the power dynamics at play. What I want you to think about, start to build and manage your internal influence. Think about those people that you need to have in your camp. And maybe it's not something that's on the calendar already, but think about those people that might be a factor in your future. Who is important to your boss? Who is important to your peers? Take some time to make some relational investment in them. Can be, comment that you make after a meeting that you're in with them and you say, hey, listen, I really thought that was so helpful. I liked how you framed that up for everybody. So good. Like even a comment like that can put some investment in that relationship equity you have. So build those relationships and be aware of where you need to manage your internal influence. And if it's with the outside, how do you need to build those relationships proactively? Start thinking about another thing to do is what are those important things to the other side? Before you go in, be mindful of what do I need to persuade? Where do I want to get them to go? What is important to them? What may be some landscape elements of their politics that they're maneuvering through that I need to consider? So start to look at it from even if you're spending a little bit of time right before, just to brainstorm, that can be really helpful to identify in that moment. And then think about framing it. Start framing it to make it make sense to them and showing that you understood where they're coming from. Think about those principles of persuasion that I highlighted and where you stand with those and start applying those. And then what you might want to consider or to continue to do is really cultivating your emotional intelligence around these factors. Pay attention. Don't multitask. Start to be an observer in meetings if you're not a key person in the conversation. Even watching with your clients what questions are important to them. Where do they sit and see their landscape? Just being an observer of that can raise your emotional intelligence around how do you need to maneuver with that specific person. And if it's something that you need to do to journal about or write down to remember, have a notebook so that when you go in front of these people and need to persuade them, you can look back at what you've learned about them through those observations that you've done. And just be aware that sometimes logic and we should do this doesn't always apply. Balance the politics as well. Continue to look at what's important to them, what's important to the business, what's important to the team. all of those things can be ways to persuade somebody to do something if you're looking at it from all sides and you're aware of what's important to them. And you help them see through the way that you're framing it up to them of how this plugs into the business overall. Maybe they're so focused on why they want to say no or what's important to their team that if they just can get a little tilt up and see it from a different perspective, you can be really helpful to them. So help by continuing to look at how do you shift their perception in a way that they'll listen to you. Sometimes when I want to reframe somebody, I will say, hey, I totally get where you're coming from. And I love that you focus on what's really important to your team. But let's just take a step back. I had to do this when I was thinking about this for us is if we look at the long-term effect of the opportunities for our team and we think about this project and how it relates to the business, when we look at the long term, these are the benefits that your team will achieve or see. Let's talk about that. How can we connect the dots? So it's like thinking about how do you shift them? When I think about framing, I always think about what do I need to do to get them to kind of look up and look at it differently? And sometimes that's just being open, especially when you have a good relationship with them and saying, hey, listen, this is how I see it. I'd love to see how you see it. And then how do you need to shift that for them? So persuasion is really interesting. And it's those key factors, those principles are really key to thinking about that. But being mindful and being really open to realizing that, okay, I need to persuade this person. What do I need to do? So what do you need to stop, start, and continue for you? What are you going to challenge yourself to do? What are you going to write down and say, I agree with this. This is something that's a blind spot for me. This is what I'm going to start doing. I don't want people just to listen to this and not do something. I would love to know what shifted for you in this. What was the aha that you had that maybe you just have heard before, but you heard differently today? When we come back, I'll tie it up for us. I want to challenge you again to really think about what you're going to take away, but stay right here. I'm so glad that you made the choice to be here today. Again, what are you going to stop doing? Stop ignoring what people believe about you. What are the perceptions? What do you need to change about that? What are you going to start doing where you manage through the perceptions? How do you reframe? What are you going to do? What are you going to start doing to change that? Maybe even just identifying when it is a situation where you need to persuade. And then what are you going to continue doing? How do you increase your EQ? How do you start to observe, continue to observe and build on those relationships? So do something, take something away. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love for you to continue the conversation. I'll talk about these topics and give you a little bit more in my Adopting a Negotiator Mindset newsletter. So you can sign up for it on negotiationlove.com or just reach out to me. And I'd love to hear what your takeaway, your aha was from today. Until next time, don't forget, negotiation is more than a skill. It's a mindset. I look forward to seeing you again.